Right now, at this exact moment, there are roughly 1.5 billion cattle alive on Earth. That is one cow for every 5 humans. Every single one of them can trace its ancestry back to a wild animal that no longer exists. An animal so massive and dangerous that ancient hunters painted its image on cave walls, the way we might photograph a lion today. That animal was the aurochs. Over 10,000 years ago, a handful of Neolithic farmers in the Middle East managed to do what Roman emperors would later call impossible. They domesticated this beast. By selectively breeding the tamest individuals over centuries, the 6-foot-tall wild animal became something a farmer could manage. But as farming spread, the wild aurochs lost its habitat, eventually shrinking into a single protected forest in Poland before the final female died out in 1627. The footprint left behind by this domestication is staggering. Today, livestock accounts for roughly 77% of all agricultural land on the planet, a landmass the size of North and South America combined. Yet, despite using more than 3/4 of our farmland, it produces only about 18% of the world's calories. The decision to tame the aurochs set off a chain of consequences that reshaped continents and built empires, but it also created a persistent tension between our food supply and the stability of the planet. In the ancient world, cattle were far more than a source of protein. In ancient Egypt, they were associated with the goddess Hathor and depicted constantly in tomb paintings. Owning a herd was a sign of divine favor, and beef was a rare luxury reserved primarily for priests and the upper classes. This connection between cows and wealth became so deeply embedded that it shaped our language. The English word capital shares a root with the Latin word for cattle. For thousands of years, a cow was a living store of value, a marker of social standing that you didn't casually slaughter for dinner. When Christopher Columbus brought cattle to the Americas in 1493, he introduced a biological force the continent had never seen. Feral herds soon roamed native grasslands that had evolved without large domestic herbivores. Their hooves compacted soil that had never been trampled, triggering an immediate shift in ecosystems that had developed over millennia. By the time modern technology arrived, humanity had already made cattle a prerequisite for civilization, establishing a baseline of demand that was ready to be exploited by industry. The 1800s removed the final biological limits of the trade. The American Civil War created massive demand for meat in the North, while Texas sat on millions of untouched cattle. Starting in 1867, cowboys drove these herds hundreds of miles north to railroad towns, connecting the open range to the urban East. But the real shift happened on the rails. In 1878, the refrigerated railroad car was perfected, allowing meat packers to slaughter cattle in a central hub and ship the beef anywhere without it spoiling. Suddenly, beef went from a seasonal, local luxury to a national commodity available year-round. Chicago became the center of this new empire. The Union stockyards grew into a square mile of pens and processing plants that handled 18 million animals a year. By 1890, just 4 companies controlled virtually every aspect of the American beef supply chain. Industrialization successfully stripped the animal of its biological context, permanently turning a living creature into an endlessly scalable, mechanized product. In the 1950s, the fast food hamburger became a national obsession, requiring a type of beef that was fast, cheap, and perfectly repeatable. To feed this new appetite, the industry had to reinvent cattle farming once again. This led to the creation of the CAFO, or Concentrated Animal Feeding Operation. Instead of roaming across grasslands, cattle are packed into feedlots and fed a heavy diet of corn and soy. A steer that might take 5 years to reach weight on grass can now be ready for market in just 14 months. The resource cost of this speed is immense. Producing 1 kilogram of beef requires roughly 15,400 liters of water, about 100 full bathtubs. For that same kilogram, the greenhouse gas emissions are equivalent to 50 times those of burning a kilogram of coal. A large part of that footprint comes from methane. Because cattle are ruminants, they produce methane during digestion and release it through burping. Over a 20-year time frame, methane is 86 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. This demand drives the destruction of the planet's most critical carbon sinks. In the Amazon basin, cattle ranching is responsible for an estimated 70%. Beef is woven into the identity of the American West and the cultural traditions of Argentina and East Africa. For millions, cattle remain a primary livelihood and a marker of standing, much as they were in ancient Mesopotamia. Yet the data shows that global livestock production contributes roughly 14 to 15% of all greenhouse gas emissions. That is more than the total carbon footprint of the entire United States, every car, every factory, and every power plant in the country. There are efforts to hack the system. Researchers are testing seaweed additives that could reduce methane burps by 80%, and companies are perfecting lab-grown meat to provide the same protein without the environmental cost of a live animal. But none of these solutions have reached the necessary scale. The UN projects that global meat production could double by 2050 if current trends hold. The scientific consensus is clear. The planet cannot absorb that increase without risking severe climate instability. The aurochs is gone, but its descendants occupy more land than any other domesticated animal on Earth. We took a wild creature the size of a car and scaled it into a global system that nature never intended. And now we must decide if we can manage the environmental bill finally coming due.